It's interesting. I've had the honor of actually doing this speech 3 times. So I was 24, I'm 25, and now this year to talk about what's going on in the world. And last year, when I was here, it was the day before inauguration. Trump was coming into the White House, and we talked about it was the end of the world as we know it, and that was how we led into the discussion. And the reality is, it really was the end of the world as we knew it in many, many ways, whether it be with geopolitics, whether it be with tech. Everything changed, or a lot of things changed. And I think one of the things that we all have to realize as an industry is we're in a new place. And it's a great place. And I think one of the things that we want to reinforce is there are a lot of positive elements that have happened in the last year. There's been a lot of negative things. There's been a lot of issues around the world. But the reality is our industry has been a leader. It's actually the fastest growing portion of the economy, and it's actually driving human innovation. And we're changing people's lives right now as we speak today. And some of the things I'll talk about, some of the applications that are coming are going to change humankind for the next century. I think we're in a place that people really do not understand. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting. And I think what you're going to hear from a lot of these speakers, because we're actually pivoting a lot away from just being telecom, data center, and hardware providers. You're actually going to see the software and the application teams. You're going to actually see a lot of the players that are in the industry that actually are riding on our infrastructure and building that next generation of applications coming to this conference. In fact, this year, there's almost 600 people that are in the application space that are actually at this conference. So we're actually in a very, very different spot. Let's talk about where we are as a world. The world is not, actually, it started kind of, it was the end of the world as we know it. And in April, we thought it might be going in a different direction. We had going everywhere, and it was a very, very big change in the stock market. Reality is, it all rallied back. Tech came back, it kind of lifted the economy, and we ended up finishing the year with actually the stock market's up. It was actually one of the better performing years for capital markets across the board, which is a good thing, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. It was good that we actually generated very good growth, but there's a part of the economy that didn't grow. And there were some issues there. And so I think this is one of the things that we'll talk about as we get later. But I think one of the things that was important was the large 8 tech companies and what they did in terms of spending CapEx was a key driver. They actually increased their capital budgets by 50% last year. And if you look at that alone, if you looked at it, and we had the same issue last year, if we take out that investment that happened from the over-the-top players, the US economy was generally either negative or just flat. And so one of the things that's important to realize is that the impact that's happening from this tech sector is actually what's driving growth across the United States and across many markets around the world. One of the things that's interesting also is last year we had the first major energy CEO sit here on the panel with us. This year we have 5 of the largest power companies in the world sitting here with either their CEO or senior executives. And I think it's a testament to where our industry has expanded to another level of infrastructure, which is also the power generation and what that means to us as we go forward. One of the other things that's interesting is when I talk around with financial analysts, and this is an interesting chart. These are 3 of the top analysts in the world, and they actually give us very different views of the world. It's actually fascinating. And this is one of the things that you'll see from these analysts. When we bring up our various panelists, the reality is no one really knows how big or how fast. And one of the things, I had a discussion with Gio yesterday, who's coming up, he'll be on the next panel. But Gio talked about the velocity of change and the limitations of velocity of change. And some of these things, and that really relates to how fast can we bring power on stream? How fast can we produce chips? How fast are the applications actually disseminated to the market? All these things drive AI. And it doesn't mean that AI is not going to grow. AI will be the thing that's in the background for all of us. And the reality is, I know that many of us still make money from cloud. Some of us in this room actually make money from voice services, and some of us actually make money from the old-fashioned internet. And these things are going to continue. But AI is going to play a role in all of those things going forward. And so we'll spend a lot more time probably on the impact of AI this year than we normally would in one of these conferences. So here are the things we're going to talk about. One of the things is what we call supersized infrastructure. We're also going to talk about, many of you may not know Michael Porter, but because of my age in the 1990s, I actually went to business school, and Michael Porter was one of the great scholars. He talked about the competitive advantage of nations and how nations actually will come together. Governments and corporates will actually align in a strategy to actually make nations more powerful. And one of the things that AI is doing, because of the amount of investment that's required, is we're starting to see that Porter type of style where actually governments are integrated into the commercial aspects of our businesses and actually operate. And this is an interesting trend because you're seeing this not only in China, but you're also seeing it in the United States, and you're seeing it in Western Europe. I think one of the other things is you're going to see, I have a new group, I call them Nouveau Tech because they don't want to be called the neo-clouds, but there's a new group of companies that are here in a big force, and they're actually, some of the new tech companies have started up. Some of these companies have actually just begun in the last 3 years, and some of them are some of the highest performing companies on our stock market today, and they're here actually in force. One of the other things that I like to talk about is the edge. And I'm looking at Robert Pepper out here in the audience, and we were actually just talking about it 5 minutes ago coming into the session. But one of the biggest things that we have to think about, everyone's been focused on these gigawatt campuses all over and how you actually build network and infrastructure to them. But the reality is, what happens after you build a training model and you actually have to actually deploy it? Today we've built edge infrastructure that's designed for clouds. We've done it designed to deal with internet services to deliver video. But now how do you actually deliver artificial intelligence? How do you actually build relationships between AI and the end user? And what does the network look like? It's a very different view. And I think one of the things that we're going to talk to a lot of these experts about is how does that actually look as we go forward? And then finally, I will talk about what's called the canaries in the digital mines. And this is some of the things that scare me. The things, and I think if you're a CEO, that keeps you up at night. And I think, and these is sort of, some of this is like the 404 course with the private equity guys, but one of it is really about what happens with telecom networks. Because if you look at telecom networks today, the capital that we're spending, okay, it doesn't actually match with the reality of what we actually need to get done. If you look at the size of the networks that need to be built, subscribers aren't actually paying what needs to be paid to actually build those networks today. So that's one of the issues. The second is what I call the K-shaped economy, which is the thing that I alluded to earlier, which is we're actually in a world right now where tech is going this way, but the rest of the industries are kind of going like this. And so how do you actually deal with this as you go forward? Because it creates large disparity of wealth across the board. Most of the people in this room are happy and smiling because their stocks are all going up. But there's a lot of people around the United States and around the world that aren't so happy about where things are going. And finally, one of the things and this is an interesting discussion, which is the digital infrastructure is changing. And how we actually operate a data center today is very different than the way we did it even just 2 years ago. And actually how we build it is very different. And that building actually has an impact in terms of what we're actually doing in terms of investment. And so if you start to look at the ecosystem as a whole, you're going to start to realize that there's actually some very, very big chinks in the armor as we start to look at the digital ecosystem as it goes forward. Not to scare people, but I think there's some things that we got to keep in the back of our minds as we go forward. So real quick, what are the big trends? This is interesting, a slide that was sent to me from one of our colleagues here at PTC. This is the data center complex in Wisconsin. It actually right now uses more power than the entire city of Los Angeles, which is pretty impressive. And this is one data center campus. This has never been done before. Like, this is the first time that actually an urban center is actually being dwarfed by a data center. But it actually shows the scale that we're actually starting to see and the movement where we're headed to in the next 5 years is going to be, this won't be the only place that's actually going to be bigger than Los Angeles. By the end of next year, there'll be 7 campuses that are bigger than Los Angeles. And by the year after that, there'll be 19. So just to give you some idea, this is just the beginning of the future. The other thing that's interesting is the shift is, if you look at the data center operators today, if you look at the top chart there, that's Digital Realty. They've been the leader in the data center space for the last 2 decades, essentially. Going forward, it's very likely that one of the new data center operators will be bigger than Digital Realty, and they'll do it with just 2 campuses or 2 buildings. So the reality is we could actually be in a position at some point where this entire chart, these companies, which have been the darlings of the internet on the stock market, could actually be not even in first, second, and third place. They could actually be dropping into the bottom. They could be dropping 4 or 5 slots. And that could actually happen in the next 2 to 3 years, which is pretty amazing. One of the things also, this is just to give you some idea, this is the capital that's spent. Many of you have seen this slide before, but I like to talk about it. This is what the largest players in the industry are actually spending this year. And when I showed you that earlier chart, that's what they spent last year, but it's almost up 52% year on year, and it's projected to go up another 54% as we go into 2026. They haven't actually released their numbers, so we actually only have preliminary numbers. So it's very difficult for us to actually project that. But reality is there are people that will actually, we will hear about this as we go through the next 2 days. One of the things also that's interesting, data centers used to take 2 to 5 years to build. If you look at the new Anthropic data center that was built in Carlisle, it was built in essentially less than 2 years. It was a gigawatt center that was built in 24 months. This is unheard of. Okay, if you look at the speed at which we're actually building infrastructure, it's never been done at this speed before. And it's actually interesting because we'll come to this chart later on. This thing requires a gigawatt of power. And if you start looking at the power industry can't get to a gigawatt of power in 2 years. So it's, and some of these things that you'll see is what we're actually doing as an industry, we're actually becoming highly efficient in what we do. But the challenge is going to be, can the infrastructure stay with us? Can we actually build at the same speed? And can the infrastructure that supports us grow at the same speed? Just to show you how people are very interested, when you look at the big four, this is a step that I thought was very, very interesting. This is the first time a hyperscaler actually bought a power company. And I think this is the first of what may be a series of things that will happen over time. But the reality is they've actually acquired, this is the first time it's been done. But the reality is there will be, I think, more stories about this as we start to think about how you actually generate power and actually how do you bring the investment directly into the power generation. Let's talk about submarine cables. Yesterday, the rooms were filled at this conference talking about what is going on with submarine cables. Submarine cables are almost 100 times the size that they were 5 years ago in terms of the amount of capacity you could actually put through a submarine cable. And the reason why submarine cables have become important is because this chase for power. And one of the things that's very interesting, if you start looking at, we used to build submarine cables to connect population centers. This year, we're actually connecting locations that have electricity. And one of the things that's very interesting is that these AI centers leave the United States or the shores of the United States, or even stay within the United States, they actually have to have fiber connecting them together. In some cases, and we were talking about, I met with the CEO of Zayo the other day, and he's talking about 1,000 fibers is going into one of these campuses. Think about that. One data center has 1,000 fibers. And you start thinking about, from a submarine cable perspective, you'll need at least 16 to 20 fibers going into an offshore data center, potentially. This is things that we never even thought about. We used to have one fiber pair. We'd have 4 to 8 terabits of capacity on it, and that was actually enough for an entire population. Now we're talking about 20 of those things actually going into one location. So it's completely changing the way we look at things. And the interesting thing is when you start looking at the power map, it's a very different place than the population map. Because a lot of places that actually have a lot of power don't have a lot of population, and vice versa. So it's an interesting, for example, Iceland actually produces only a small portion of, they actually have essentially power for their population, and then they have almost twice that they can use for industry. But then you go to a place like Egypt, and they don't have enough power to actually deal with all the needs in their own economy. And so this is actually going to change how we actually build networks, because we're going to have to get to those locations that have the extra power that we can bring there. This is just one of the things that also is interesting. If you look at, in 2001 was the biggest days of the Capitol. Unfortunately, by the way, that's also when the fireworks went off, for all of you that wanted to know. It's right there at the end of 2001. That was after all that investment on submarine cables. We actually have kind of hit that same range, although we've done it with about $11 billion of investment. This also shows you how much the cost has changed. So essentially you had what's the equivalent of about $45 billion worth of investment that happened in 2000. Now you're actually getting more capacity, and you're actually doing it for about 1/4 of the cost, which is amazing. Okay, so anyway, that's one of the big things. Is that what I want to do is kind of set the stage as to where we are in terms of large infrastructure build. We are in a place that none of us have ever seen before. It is the end of the world as we know it. If you start to think about, none of us have seen cables of this size, data centers of this size being deployed around the world. So we're in a place that we've never seen. What that actually has done, though, and the interesting thing is we'll have a lot of U.S. government folks here spending time with us, but it's actually brought a lot of government officials back into the game, because these things are now starting to become national issues. And if you look at this is just AI for, alone. If you look at the investment that's happening, essentially there's really, and it's interesting, if Mark Gansey was here, unfortunately he wasn't able to make it, but Mark always talks about there's basically 7 base models that are actually driving most of the internet. And 6 of them are American and 1 of them is Chinese. And then there's a bunch of other investors. But the reality is countries have realized that AI is a sovereign need that they actually have to have this capability in each one of their countries. And the United States and China are right now facing off in this, but this will also, when I come back here next year, we'll be talking about 7, 8, 10, 12, 13 other countries that will actually be playing in the space as we start to go forward. Just to prepare themselves, this is a chart I used I think I actually used it last year, but the reality is one of the key things that actually makes us successful in artificial intelligence is power. And the Chinese have done a lot of investment. They've actually built 20 nuclear power plants that are going to come on stream over the next 6 years. They will lead the world in nuclear power by the year 2030. And they'll actually lead the world in terms of total power by 2030. So they will actually have enough room in their grid to build as many models as anyone else can. America right now is going to be a third, I think it would be third in terms of, if you compare us to Western Europe in terms of power. The other thing that's very interesting is the choke point of chips. Reality is most of the chips, although the United States has focused a lot on this, most of those chips come from the Far East, whether it be in China or Vietnam. The reality is a lot of the capacity that actually builds up this entire ecosystem that we're building is actually coming from offshore, which can be scary at times when you think about it, but it's an important thing. But it's also why I think you're seeing, for example, the Americans starting to build fabs here in the United States. So there's a real movement to try and build a ecosystem here. And other countries are going to be doing the same thing. The whole idea that, having chips as a strategic asset is very important. I think when we come here next year, we'll also be talking about batteries. So I think it's going to be chips and batteries are going to become the next two things that everyone's going to be talking about, manufacturing in their home markets. These are, and I apologize for insulting some of the neo clouds because they don't like to be called that. So I came up with a new term today. It's called the Nouveau Tech. These are the new guys that are on the block and have actually played a very, very critical role in terms of deploying our new AI models. And so these are the companies that actually have been building data center capabilities. But one of the more valuable things that these companies are doing is they're actually focusing on how the next essentially generation of services that come out. So agentic, inference, those types of services, as they start to deploy, these are the companies that are going to actually help to get those applications out to the edge and actually out to the end users. And I think this is going to be a very, very important change in how we actually look at these companies going forward. And I think we will see that these companies will actually continue to play a very, very critical role. A lot of them are actually speaking here. So you're actually going to see over the next 2 days, you're going to see some of these companies talking about their business models, what the opportunities are. And this is a slide that we actually used 4 years ago. But it's interesting, we used it to talk about what's going on with cloud. But the reality is this section right here, which I call the AI extension zone, is going to be one of the most important things. Today, most of the internet that we know of as network operators comes through what we call IXs. So they're internet exchange points. And in those internet exchange points, we actually deliver our services across the internet. Well, the reality is with AI, we're going to have a new set of exchange points. We're going to have a new way to distribute because there's going to be a very, very different type of node that's sitting there. These are going to have to be smarter, bigger, stronger. And if you look at edge data centers today, they're probably, and no offense to anyone in the room, but they're probably the least sophisticated of the data centers that we have. They're smaller, they're less than a megawatt of power, but they generally are very heavily network centric. And the reality is we're going to have to get to a point where we actually have these types of centers kind of proliferating across the planet. And I think one of the things that you'll hear is a lot of these data center operators are going to talk about what happens on these AI extension areas and how do we actually build this out as we start to see these AI models coming away from these big campuses and being deployed out out around the world. One of the other things that's going to be interesting, and there's a lot of fear about AI. Everyone says, oh, this is going to change everything. People are not going to have jobs. It's going to be a very, very different world. I think it's interesting. Steve Jobs did actually have a quote. It's funny, you go back and you read about Steve Jobs, and it's amazing. He talked about just about anything, but he actually talked about AI, and he called it the bicycle for the mind. And I think one of the things that's very interesting is that the job creation, I think people that fear this should not. Reality is I think jobs are going to get more interesting. We're going to become faster as humans, and I think we're actually going to become more efficient as humans. Yes, there will be changes, and people will have to change, but we had to change with the internet. If you think about 20 years ago, we had to do things. We had to pick up the phone and call and get a reservation to go to a restaurant. Today we just push a button. In order to communicate with somebody, we actually had to dial on a telephone. And the reality is now we yell into our phone to talk to whoever we want to talk to. So the reality is the world has changed, and it constantly is changing. And AI I think it's become this animal that people are not so fond of, but the reality is it's an extension of technology, and technology is continuing to grow, and we should embrace it because I think it's a chance for all of us to be better as human beings. Okay, so those are the positives. The negatives, things that scare us a little bit. If you look around, and I moved to the United States from China 4 years ago, and so I've had the opportunity of living in the United States in Washington, D.C., and get to watch, all of the new changes of government and how it actually plays out. But the reality is, this is real, okay? What's happening in the world right now is we are in what's called a K-shaped economy. And what's going on is technology companies are accelerating, they're growing, they're actually doing very, very well. But the reality is, if you look at the rest of the stock market, if you take the tech companies out, the rest of the market's actually been declining. Bricks and mortar companies have not been doing all that well across the board. And it's not just the United States, it's in other countries around the world. And this is actually causing a lot of the challenges, not only with the economy, but also with just politics, and why politics have become very, very powerful, because there's now becoming two groups. There's the people that are making money, and there are people that are not making money. And so there's a lot of issues that are coming out of everything that's happening with this. So we're actually, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, are at the center of a lot of the problems that are actually happening across the US and around the world. And it's caused really by economy, the economic situation. The other thing that's interesting is, if I came here 20 years ago, we only talked about networks. It was first voice networks, it was data networks, and the telephone company. We were Pacific Telecom Conference, right? So we were always about telecom. Reality is, the telecom companies have become a very, very small piece of the entire ecosystem. They've essentially become a utility that transports. And the reality is, this is becoming even harder because, by the way, as we start to go into this new world of applications, these networks have to be stronger, faster, and more powerful. And the reality is we're getting less and less and less of the pie. And so where the investment actually has to happen to make these applications happen, it's very difficult because you're in a very, very difficult spot. And it's interesting, if you look at fiber operators around the world, if you look at mobile operators, they're all seeing a capital crunch. And so even though we're doing very, very well, the tech industry, we're looking at data centers really accelerating. Reality is, if you're in the fiber business or if you're in the telecom business, it's a hard slog. And I'm sure everyone that's here in this business, it's a fight every year to keep, essentially to keep yourselves just operating or even growing a little bit in this market, despite the fact that the entire industry is exploding and the ecosystem is exploding. The telecom guys are actually getting the least amount of that. But the reality is, they play probably the most critical role. If you don't have the telecom networks, you can't actually transport the applications. One of the other problems that you've got is the old economy and the new economy operate at different speeds. So if you think about making a power plant, if you look at the average nuclear power plant in the United States, it took 17 years to build a nuclear power plant. By the time you permitted it, actually built it, got the site, did all this stuff, it took 17 years. We're now building a data center that will consume 1 gigawatt of power, and we're doing that in 19 months. Okay, so you've gone, and that used to be a 5-year thing. So essentially you'd have data centers that would be building for 5 years, and then you have this 17 years to bring on the power. So now you've got a situation where you need electricity very, very fast, okay? And you actually have to do, and the other challenge you've got is we're all worried about the planet. Most people are worried. The fastest way to bring on power, by the way, is to use natural gas, or is to essentially to create steam, and actually to use what are traditional old world types of way of generating power. Nuclear power around the world, there's 19 countries that won't even allow you to bring nuclear materials into the country, okay? Let alone build a nuclear power plant. And nuclear, by the way, is probably the most efficient technology to actually go for it, going forward. But the reality is it may or may not be able to proliferate. So you have a problem right now in the sense that we're actually building, if you look at a lot of the data centers and infrastructure that's being announced, it's being announced, but the reality is the underlying infrastructure that needs to be there for them to deliver is not there. And it probably, if you look at the United States, if you look at all the data centers and applications that are going out, it's about a 20 to 30% gap between the actual power that's going to show up and the power that's needed. And so one of the big problems is going to be, how do we actually deal with this, and how do we accelerate that side of the industry? And that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of those speakers here with us at this conference to talk about that, and also the US government. Part of the problem is not necessarily the power companies. The power companies are largely regulated by governments. And so it's not only is it a power company issue, but it's also a government issue. The issue, and this is I call this the 303 or the 404 course of what's going on in the data center ecosystem. And bear with me for a second, but the big issue that we've got is take a data center that used to be a cloud data center or used to be with enterprise customers, and now you make it into an AI data center. What happens? Well, the bricks and mortar piece becomes a lot less in terms of the whole data center ecosystem. GPUs, which are the actual chips that you put in there, become a much larger component. Now, so the piece that, and the gray pieces are the great ones, because these things actually are 30-year assets that you can go out and finance, and for the finance people in here, they love financing those three things on the outside, on the bottom there, the gray stuff. The blue stuff, the GPUs, the problem with that is the life is a year, 2 years, 3 years. Typically, you would have cycles of 4 to 5 years with these chips. Now you're getting cycles of, in some cases, less than a year. These chips are becoming obsolete. So if you look at it from just a financing perspective, you've got a growth in sort of low life assets, so assets that don't live very long, and a decline in long-term assets, which are the actual infrastructure to build the data centers. So if you start to think about it, this is starting to create a new situation where it's going to be more difficult to finance using debt, for example, data centers. And this will happen over time, but this is the reality. So there's a lot of problems that will come in this area, but it probably will move through the system over the next 2 to 3 years. But it is something to keep our eyes on and think about, because it really is a fundamental change. It's not something that all of us wake up and say, oh, this is happening, it's going to blow up the world. But we're going to start to see this as we start to think about how these data centers are actually built and how this ecosystem is built. The next 48 hours. It's a good group. We've got 26 CEOs that are actually to come up here, everything from the power industry to the data center industry. A lot of the leaders that I showed you on the data center space are there. We're gonna have a lot of the what I call the hyperscale senior executives here. It is gonna be a fantastic show. And I will tell you, we handpicked all of these speakers so they can actually debate a lot of these important issues. So even my first discussion we'll have a power guy, a private equity guy, and a data center guy, all talking about the same things and arguing about what the future is going to look like. But I think it is probably one of the best and most dynamic group of speakers we've ever had here for the PTC. So, just to finish, and this is actually, Paul Allen had a great quote, and the one thing that I would say is, and he actually talked about the change from trains to airplanes, okay? And this is something that happened in the 1920s and 1930s. Most people in that period of time, actually, if they were going on a long trip, they went on a train. And then the airplane showed up. And everyone said, oh, we're gonna lose all these jobs, because the railroads actually employed tons of people. And the reality was, it actually made humans better. It actually made us global. It actually made us, someone in California could get to know someone in New York. You could actually move between the coasts of a large country. In China, you could go from one end of the country to the other. And it changed, and you could do it in a matter of hours. And this totally changed the way people work together. And the reality is, AI is going to be like that. AI is just going to accelerate how we actually work together, how we actually do things. And it shouldn't be looked at, in my view, as a negative, but it should be seen as a positive and something that we all should embrace, because it's actually going to make humans more efficient and better. And I'm looking forward to spending the next couple days with you talking about all this. Thank you very much.